Meredith's Cook here for FCS All-In. We're going to start off this special edition playoff episode with a conversation with Thor Bjorn, chair of the FCS Football Committee. Thanks for joining us again, Thor.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on with you.
Absolutely. So we're just going to jump right in here and get started. So first off, how does it feel to get back to a full 24-team field after this past spring condensed 16-team playoffs?
It's awesome. It was a great experience, and it's funny when we were out in Indianapolis, we kept talking about sort of the spring championship, and although there were a lot of new people on the committee, it brought back some crazy memories, and so this year was much more pleasant, much more enjoyable, just because we knew we were back, like you said, to 24 teams the way it should be.
I'm sure. Now, there were many happy teams this past weekend, and as always is the case when any NCAA bracket is announced, a few disappointed ones. So for those last few teams in or out, how does the committee compare their resumes? What's the determining factor or tipping point there?
There's so many different determining factors, and at the end of the day, we really did spend a lot of time just, when we compared, like, you think about different areas. So, like, obviously the top 8 seeds, critically important. And then within the top 8, you think about the 2 versus 3 seed, critically important. And then when you think about the last 3 teams out, we would sit there and just sort of compare. How do they stand? How does Mercer stand? How does Eastern Kentucky stand? How does Rhode Island stand to the teams that ultimately got in? Northern Iowa being really one of the last teams that did make it. And, you really try to open your mind and look at, okay, what's the apples to apples comparisons? Who did they beat? Who did they play? And it's not easy. And, it's interesting. I mean, there were two members of the committee, myself being one of them, that had their teams that didn't make it, were one of the 3 out. And, but one of the things that I am most proud of is as a committee, we really do, look at what's best for the championship, not what's best for your own institution. And that's not always easy, but it's what the requirement is. And again, it's frustrating. It's hard, but you know what? I feel really good about the group that got in.
You've got a tough job there. Now, the Missouri Valley and Big Sky make up a majority of this year's at-large field. Does the committee weigh the strength of the schedule of the league as a whole when making its final selections?
I think we do. It's a great question, and it sounds crazy to say this, but it always sort of plays itself out. And, the CAA in the past has always been one of those, I would say in the top 3 leagues that's had numerous teams that have gotten in this year. The CAA only got the 2 in. But when you look at the Valley and you look at the Big Sky, I mean, 2 great years from those schools. And what they did is they didn't beat each other up. So if you look at the 6 from the Valley that got in, or the 5 from the Big Sky that got in, they were able to separate themselves from the other group in that league. And in the CAA this year, not so much. I mean, JMU and Villanova certainly did. Rhode Island was close, but at the end of the day, we really weren't. We were 4-4 in the league. And so when you look at, I think, 5 or 6 other teams within the CAA that were 4-4. So really trying to sit back and say, Northern Iowa got in the Valley. I think they were 6-5, but they beat 3 teams that were in the field. They played 6. I mean, that's amazing. And so really trying to look at, or having an opportunity, like in any team in the Big Sky or like any team in the Valley this year, they played some of the best and they were able to win some of those games. And obviously, there were times that a team beat somebody else, but, and then they, think about Montana State, Montana and Eastern Washington, everybody sort of beating each other, but they didn't let that really sort of wind their way down to where they had 5 losses or even 4. I mean, that was the big difference. Does that make sense? I mean, I hope it does. I know what I'm trying to articulate, but the way that the 2 leagues separated themselves with the top teams, I think made a big difference.
100%. Now, when it comes to the first round, how are home game sites determined, and does geography factor into bracketing?
That is a great question, and I'm so glad you asked it. Yes. So the way it works is once we select the teams, then we see the top 8, and then so those top 8 are sort of put on the side because they're the ones that get the first round bye, and then we seed or bracket everybody else, and that's really done through geography, and it's almost like putting a puzzle together because we're obligated to try to minimize flights as best we can. So you look at, okay, who can Team X play that's a 400 or less drive rather than having to fly to save costs. I mean, that way we can continue to try to have as many teams in this field as we possibly can, and you do that by managing costs. And then once the bracket is set, you open up the bids. So we don't look at the bids until after the teams have been selected to play each other. And then for the most part, whoever had the highest bid can host the game, so long as their facilities can handle it, and they have the lights necessarily needed to host a night game. So it all really works itself out, but it's like putting a big puzzle piece together.
I'm sure. I'm sure it is. Now, a hot topic this year has been the subject of expanding the playoffs. What are your thoughts on that? And do you see any changes coming in the near future?
I certainly hope so. I mean, when you think about the leagues are sort of growing, so the opportunity for the AQ is growing, so the need grows. I mean, if we have one more team or one more league that's going to be part of this field, it has to expand, or you start having to have some sort of play-in to make it into the field. And I hope it doesn't get to that point. I hope that, we're able to go to 26 or 28. So many great teams out there, so many great deserving programs that would love to have access. The expansion from a few years ago to where we are today was terrific. And, you and I were talking about this a little bit before we got on the interview. I mean, FCS football is such a unique thing. I mean, it's such great football, and we're so fortunate with the great coverage we get now, whether it's through ESPN or Fubo or Flow Sports, whoever. It's terrific, and it's only going to continue to grow. So, I think people are realizing that when you come out and watch an FCS game, you're going to watch high quality football that feels like an FBS level, game because of the production that's being done these days. So I hope it continues to grow. It's deserving, and it's certainly a great sport.
Awesome. Yes, totally agree with that. FCS football is awesome. So the SWAC earned its first FCS playoff berth since 1997 when Florida A&M was selected. What stood out specifically when looking at the Rattlers?
Wow, what a great program and what a great year. And we were certainly excited that they made the championship this year. Well deserved. And they were ranked, Jackson State was ranked really high throughout and I'm not talking about the coaches poll, I'm talking about the committee poll throughout the year. And Florida A&M, having that close game, only losing to them by 1 point, you sit back and say, wow, what's, that 1 point difference, a 1 point loss, against a really, really good team that's been ranked high all year. We really need to be spending some time thinking about Florida A&M and what they've been like all year. And so they got in early, well deserved. It wasn't certainly near the end of the selection because of the work they did throughout that year. They had one FBS loss and then a 1 point loss to Jackson State, who would have absolutely made the playoffs too if they weren't going into the Celebration Bowl opportunity. So it was fun. It was exciting to watch. It was exciting to see them on the selection show and be part of that celebration with them.
Now, looking at the national seats, there were around 10 teams maybe deserving of 8 spots. With a tough decision to make there, what tipped the scales for those final couple of national seats?
It really is hard. And, what we'd end up doing is we really would just take, comparison. So what you do is you sit and you vote. And if you don't have a team that's under consideration, you actually can sit down and vote for the seeds, and you can actually rank them 1 through 8. And so we do that. And a lot of times they play out. So, 1, 2, 3, 4 was really pretty straightforward. And then when you start getting a little higher up, you have to spend a lot more time having a conversation. The NCAA system is really set up so you can't rush it. You have to take your time. And the most you can ever do is put in the half of the available spots, that are there. So like when you think about 13 at-large spots, the most you can ever put in at the beginning is 7. So that's the same way when we start seeding 1 through 8, and you really have to spend a lot of time figuring out who's worthy, who's deserving, and you do that after the votes are taken. Then you can kind of see how it plays out. And what we ended up doing, it sounds very old school, is we had a whiteboard and didn't list the names of the schools, just put their profiles next to each other and really started to look at okay, how did they do against the field? How many games did they play? How many Division II games did they play? That certainly came, because you're always looking for one reason that somebody may be a little bit more deserving. Because when you do get 9-10, they were great teams and certainly could have been seeded. So it's a challenge. But I like the process that we went through, and I feel really good about where we ultimately came and got to. I'm sure that those teams that didn't get that seed don't feel the same way. I get that, but at the end of the day, you only can put in 8 and in that seated position, and it's hard. But again, I feel good about it. Time will tell. Now we just have to go see how it plays out.
Right, exactly. So a lot of good insight here. Again, thank you so much. Appreciate you being on here and sharing all this insight with us. Now, this last one may be the toughest question, but what Thanksgiving dish was left out of the Bjorn family dinner, and which one was the top choice to advance to seconds?
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's a great one. So my wife makes this incredible meat stuffing that I didn't know or ever have until I met her, and so I think I had 5 helpings of that yesterday, and that's ridiculous. And my daughter just got married in June, and she ended up making these like creamed onion things that her husband's family really like. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I left that one out. I did, and I felt bad because they kept saying how great it was. I'm like, I can't do it. I can't do it. But we had a wonderful Thanksgiving together, so it was pretty special.
Good. I'm glad to hear that, and appreciate your honesty there. I say that stuffing is definitely the top tier Thanksgiving food, no competition whatsoever. So that's
no competition. That's right.
No competition. All right, Thor, thanks so much for your time today and for your insight. Next up, we have Bryson Lester in a segment with our national correspondent, Sam Herder of Hero Sports, and Craig Haley of Stats Perform.
Welcome into a special FCS playoff edition of FCS All-In here on YouTube. I'm Bryson Lester, your host today, as we've got our 2 national correspondents here to break down the FCS playoff bracket. Thanks for being here with us, gentlemen. We've got Craig Haley from Stats Perform and Sam Herder from Hero Sports. We've got a lot to talk about with this bracket, so we're just going to go ahead and dive right in here. Craig, a lot of happy and also disappointed teams after this weekend. How did the FCS playoff field line up with some of your own predictions here?
You're right. I mean, there's always going to be a few teams left out or disappointed, but I think it was a pretty solid field. I mean, kudos to the committee, Mr. Bjorn and the committee. I think it was close to expected the way most people thought it would go. I mean, I had one wrong. I had Northern Iowa not getting in and Rhode Island getting in, but I mean, that they were Rhode Island, Mercer were kind of the last 2 that you could make a case for. I think the seeds went well, more or less. I mean, Eastern Washington probably is miffed but there were like 9 teams for 8 spots. So I do think they did a good job, because I feel like I've heard fewer complaints than you get in a typical year, and you're always going to have complaints.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sam, same question to you, as you were putting your bracketology together Saturday night, how did what the final bracket end up comparing to what you were expecting?
Yeah, it was this season was a lot like past seasons where, weeks 10 and 11, it looks like the bubble is going to be really packed. But by the time all the games end, all of a sudden you look at it and the bubble isn't, quite as hard to figure out as what it may have seemed to be a couple of weeks ago. I was able to get all 24 teams in correctly. The only mistake I made was I had Eastern Washington as a seed and ETSU was not a seed. And I certainly feel like Eastern Washington has a great case to be a seed, but at the same time, you look at East Tennessee State, 10-1, Power 5 win, that's hard not to seed. But for the most part, I think the brackets kind of played out as how I was expecting it to play out.
Absolutely. Craig, let's talk about those national seeds real quick. When you look at those 8 teams, which team, in your opinion, has the clearest path to Frisco here?
Oh, Bryson, it's clearly North Dakota State. I mean, they're peaking, of course, but they're going to be at home, through the semifinals as long as they keep advancing. East Tennessee State has had a great year, but, East Tennessee State's going to be up against it if that's a quarterfinal matchup in the Fargo Dome. And then North Dakota State, if they get, in the semis against, say, a James Madison, that entire week will be about avenging that one home loss here in the last 10 years, which was to JMU in 2016. So I think it's set up for the Bison to get to Fargo. I'm not saying, I think there's 3-4 teams that are really strong to get there, but I think as far as setup, yeah, you'd have to say NDSU, getting to Fargo.
Sam, when you look at the entire field here, who would you identify as a dark horse or two that has been flying under the radar a little bit here that could make some real noise in this bracket?
Yeah, they might not necessarily be under the radar just because they made it to Frisco last spring. But as far as an unseeded team that could make a decent run, I think that team is South Dakota State, just because you look at how things shook out in the bracket. The three teams that the Jacks lost to, they're all on the opposite side. You also have two top-tier national title contenders, North Dakota State and James Madison, on the opposite side. One of the hottest teams right now is Montana. They're on the opposite side. And then Eastern Washington, who we touched on, who is definitely a seedable team, they're also on the opposite side of South Dakota State. And the Jacks are super talented. They're getting healthy. They played without a few All-American level guys throughout this season, but all those guys are back now. And I think they have a favorable draw to a certain extent. They'll have to go on the road a couple of times, obviously, to make a deep playoff run. But I think the Jacks have things in place to be that one unseeded team that maybe makes it further than some people think.
Good stuff there. Craig, the Missouri Valley Football Conference got 6 teams in the field this year. One of those was Northern Iowa. Did it surprise you that the Panthers made it in the field at all?
Well, again, if they weren't in, they'd be right there on the bubble. So yes, I mean, you could go either way on their resume. I mean, it's probably the highest strength of schedule of all the teams in the field. I mean, if you look at, they beat Sacramento State and South Dakota State on the road. So yeah, they've kind of earned their way in. At the same time, there's always going to be a few that say, hey, look, they have 5 losses. I mean, we mentioned Eastern Washington before. I mean, you talk about a tough first round game. That you don't want to be staring at the Panthers across from you in the first round, and it's just a case of their strength of schedule getting them in.
So when you look at the entire field here, the Missouri Valley and the Big Sky had 11 of those 24 teams that qualified for the FCS playoff. I know it's kind of been a topic of conversation all year, but now that we're seeing that big a number again, is it time to reevaluate here and look at 24 teams and consider expansion?
I would say no. I know there are some commissioners that would disagree with me on that, but I think 24 teams is plenty. I don't think the FCS should go less. I don't think they should go more. I mean, if there was, big momentum on expanding, I would say go to 28 teams and not 32 teams, because then you can at least seed or give the top 4 seeds a bye if you have 28 teams. But if you go to 32, you're not rewarding the seeds for getting a bye. All those teams, depending on the calendar, all 32 teams would play on Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving games typically don't draw very well. So I think there's a lot more negatives to expanding to 32 than positives. And even now, like we kind of talked about, I think the bubble isn't always super strong either with 24 teams. And when that's the case, it's not like there's 8 teams really knocking on the door to make the playoffs. So I personally think 24 is plenty for the FCS playoffs.
Craig, the last time we talked, we chatted about this. You look at the SWAC, they got a team in the FCS playoff field this year, first time since 1997. How big of a deal is that for both the FCS and the SWAC?
It's a big deal, of course. I mean, it's been a possibility all year, and Florida A&M, pulled it off to get in that large bid. The conference obviously has struggled in the past. They were 0-19 all time in the playoffs. Same time, Florida A&M, before becoming a SWAC member, has done well. I mean, even in the MEAC and even before in the MEAC. So I think it's big because they're playing a nighttime game here, kind of the spotlight against Cole Kelly, the reigning Peyton Award winner. People are going to be paying attention to that because the Florida A&M has great defensive talent. It's kind of an offense versus defense game. So it's a big spotlight here for Florida A&M and also the SWAC.
Sam, there's a lot of good ones but when you look across the bracket of the first round matchups, which one really jumps off the page to you? Which first round contest are you excited to watch the most here?
I think the strongest first round matchup is Northern Iowa against Eastern Washington, just because, like we talked about, Eastern Washington was close to being a seed, and Northern Iowa is the type of team that can, lose to anyone but also beat anyone. So I think that's probably the strongest matchup. The one I'm most looking forward to, and we just touched on it, is Florida A&M against Southeastern Louisiana. SLU is one of the best offenses in the country, but they're going up against will probably be the strongest defense they've played. FAMU is number 8 in scoring defense and number 4 in total defense, really strong defensively. And so just watching that offense versus defensive matchup is going to be really cool.
Good stuff. And then, Craig, it gets talked about, but, just kind of put into perspective here. When you look at the home field advantage through the FCS playoff, how big of a deal is that for these teams?
Well, you certainly want to have it. And don't let anybody say otherwise, because if you look back, if you discount the spring playoff one, which is down to 16, I mean, the 24 team playoffs, we'll use 5 years prior to that as a sample. I mean, you're talking over 2/3 of the home teams won in those 5 years. I think it was 25-5 in the quarterfinals and semifinals combined. Yes, I mean, obviously teams are going to win on the road. You look at Southern Illinois going and beating Weber in the spring playoffs first round when it was 16. But yeah, you definitely want to have home field advantage for every game and get that comfort level.
Oh, absolutely. Good stuff. All right, guys, toughest question of the day. I know you've been looking forward to answering this one. Aside from turkey, which Thanksgiving dish is nationally seeded for you guys? Who's the number one? Who's the number 2 seed? What is the number 2 seed behind turkey on the Thanksgiving plate? Sam, we'll go to you first.
I love some mashed potatoes and some really salty gravy. That would be my number 2 seed right there.
Got you, Craig. What's on your Thanksgiving plate over there?
Well, my mother-in-law Lindsay makes this outstanding stuffing. I'm not even just giving it the number 2 seed. I'm giving it the national championship.
Wow.
So
Wow.
you'll be glad to learn that from me.
National championship stuffing. No, we absolutely love it. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. Just can't wait to watch some football today. We got a lot of exciting games coming up, but we want to give you guys a quick second here to plug what you got. Sam, a lot of coverage coming up from you, I'm sure, but what can fans be on the lookout to see?
Yeah, one thing I do weekly throughout the playoffs, which is really fun for me, is basically my national title favorites. And so this week it's a 24-1 ranking for who's most likely to win the national title. Then next week it'll be 16-1, and then obviously 8-1, 4-1. Then it is national title time. And so just kind of breaking down who has the least best odds to win it and who has the best chance to win the national title is something I look forward to doing every week.
Awesome. And then Craig, we've got finalists for awards. So, it's getting down to crunch time for those babies. What's going on out there?
Yeah, Bryson, that's taken over for us at Stats Perform. I mean, we're 2 weeks away from the Jerry Rice winner, the Eddie Robinson, the Doris Robinson, 3 actually. And then, obviously the Peyton and Buchanan will announce before the national championship game. So yeah, it's a big deal for us, and we'd love to honor all these great athletes and coaches.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for your time, and thanks for joining us here on a special first round edition of FCS ALL-IN.